I was standing at gate B11 with a paper cup of airport coffee that tasted like burnt almonds when the app flashed red and told me my ticket was canceled by Traveler. It took me a second to understand the screen, partly because the PA system was announcing a gate change for a flight to Tampa and partly because the man next to me was struggling with a suitcase that looked like it weighed 40 pounds and his frustration was contagious. Then my phone buzzed and my mother's text popped up so large I could read it without tapping. "Have fun walking home, loser." I stared until the lines sharpened and the words settled in my chest with that hollow feeling you get when you step off a curb you thought was there and it isn't. The agent at the counter wore a name tag that said Liz and had an expression I recognized from women who have learned how to manage strangers without catching their moods. I told her calmly that my ticket to Dallas had been canceled without my consent and I needed to rebook for tonight because my connecting trip depended on me making a meeting the next morning. She typed with the speed of a person whose fingers think faster than her mouth and said, "It says the primary account holder called in and confirmed the cancellation and Miles redeposit." I stared at the screen like it might change if I asked politely. "I booked it with my mother's miles," I said. "I was trying to be nice about a family thing. Can you see the number they used to call?" She shook her head. "We're not allowed to share that, and anyway it shows an authorized account. I can sell you a walk-up ticket, but it's going to be around 800 and the next nonstop is full." I could feel the heat rise up the back of my neck the way it does when embarrassment tries to pass itself off as anger. "Thank you," I said, and stepped aside because the line behind me had started to grow, and I didn't want people to memorize my face for a story later about a meltdown at the airport. I sat by a window where you can watch trucks move like patient beetles and called my mother even though my better judgment told me to leave her text on read. She answered on the second ring as if she'd been admiring her own meanness and hoping I would call. "You can't keep playing martyr," she said in a sing-song she uses when she wants to sound like she's joking. "If you wanted a free flight, you should have been nice at Sunday dinner." I took a breath that tasted like recycled air and hand sanitizer. "It wasn't free," I said. "I offered to pay cash and you said, 'Don't be silly, I have points.' I have to be in Dallas for the board meeting tomorrow at 9. There was a clink of ice against glass on her end, a tiny sound that always means she's at the kitchen island, not the couch. "You shouldn't be on the board anyway," she said. "You don't even know what EBITDA stands for. Your Uncle David and your stepfather do. They've kept the company from falling into a ditch since your father passed." I looked at the runway and thought about my father's funeral, the church's tall windows, the way my mother's hand had felt like marble in mine. "I'm on the board because Dad put me there," I said quietly. 51%. He intended. She cut me off the way she does when her voice wants the last word. He intended for people who know what they're doing to run things. The rest is sentiment. Buy a ticket if it matters so much. Or walk home. You're good at walking away. She hung up before I could answer. I had 3 options that made sense and one that felt petty. The petty one involved forwarding her text to my aunt with a single line that said, "Your sister is on a roll." I did not do that. Instead, I checked the time, checked my bank balance, and rented a compact car with an AC that sounded like a fan in a cheap motel. Dallas from Columbus is about 1,000 miles. I wasn't going that far by road, but I could make it to Cleveland and catch an early flight if I drove through the night and didn't let my mind wander. 2 hours north, the radio carried local news about a water main break near Lakewood, and then the Guardian's pregame show, and the sound of men predicting a bullpen strategy one still disagreed with helped keep my breathing even. Around midnight, I pulled into a rest stop, bought coffee that tasted like melted plastic and a pack of almonds, and ran cold water over my wrists in the bathroom sink because I could feel my heart climbing into my throat. "You're fine," I told my reflection, which is a sentence that has mixed success, but sometimes helps with the arms feeling too light. I made it to the Dallas office with 20 minutes to spare, my hair in a messy knot, and that stale coffee taste still in my mouth. The boardroom smelled like paper and lemon cleaner, and the kind of air freshener people choose when they want a room to feel newer than it is. My stepfather, Rick, sat at the head of the table with a binder that had more tabs than a high school biology book. My uncle David leaned back with his arms crossed, his expression mild in a way that always means he's chosen a side. Our counsel, a woman named Ms. Chu who never raises her voice, glanced at my chair when I walked in and then looked away the way good lawyers do when they don't want to be accused of coaching. Rick smiled like he does when he's about to present himself as the hero in a story. "We didn't think you'd make it," he said. "Your mother told us you decided to sit this one out." I set my folder down and put both hands on the table to stop them from shaking. "I was detained," I said. "I'm here now. Let's vote." The sale had been courting us since June, a national cold storage chain with a habit of buying regional outfits like ours, Carter Temperature Logistics, and folding them into a bigger map. My father had built the company out of 2 rented warehouses and a used fleet, and by the time he got sick, we had a dozen facilities and contracts with 3 grocery chains and a bakery. I own 51% of the voting shares by virtue of his will with a structure that assumes I wouldn't know enough to run day to day, but would know enough to keep people honest. The offer on paper was $156 million cash at close, assumption of debt, retention bonuses, the whole 9 yards. My mother hates the idea of selling because she thinks it makes us look like we lost, and because selling means her husband is no longer the guy at the helm. "We can squeeze more," she had told me back in August at Sunday dinner over pot roast and mashed potatoes. "Buyers always leave room. Besides, the market will soften. We can do better next spring." I had nodded because arguing in front of cousins makes my shoulders go tight and the gravy congeal. Now, at 9:30 on the first Tuesday after Labor Day, my stepfather clicked into a slide that said, "Our alternative plan," and a map of our facilities lit up like a parade. He wanted a refinancing, a sale-leaseback of 2 properties, and a private equity line that would give them room to expand into the Carolinas if we took on more debt and delayed the sale. He had a confident voice when he talked about debt, like someone who has never had to ask to borrow money for a set of tires. My uncle nodded along. Miss Chu closed her eyes for a second and then opened them like she was counting to 5. I let him finish because I was raised by a man who taught me to be polite when I was about to say something decisive. Then I said, "We'll take the offer. We vote today." Rick's smile faltered the way a television loses signal for a second. "You're emotional," he said. "You just crossed 2 time zones and you're hopped up on coffee. Sleep on it. We can table this to next week," and I slid the printed shareholder consent across the table with a pen. "I've read the documents," I said. "I've spoken to Miss Chu. I'll be voting my shares to approve the sale." He realized I'd come to the meeting with a plan and not a tantrum. He also realized I had arrived at 9 o'clock because our bylaws allow holders of more than 50% to notice a vote at any meeting if they're present at the start. He flicked his eyes at my uncle, then at his phone, probably to see whether my mother had texted some new angle. She had, my screen lit with a string of messages that ranged from "you are an ungrateful brat" to "you don't know what you're giving up," and the last one that felt like a dare. "Try it. Watch what happens." I turned my phone face down and told myself not to swallow too fast because that makes the mouth go dry. The counsel cleared her throat gently. "We've reviewed the offer," she said, words careful and slow. "It's not perfect, but it's clean. I've been in deals like this where families rip themselves apart for another 2% and then spend 3 months rebuilding, and the market moves under them anyway. Ms. Carter's vote is controlling. She needs to sign 3 documents and initial 4 places. By 10 we had done the thing that made me feel both steady and a little sick. Approved the sale, authorized MS. to finalize, scheduled the closing for the third Friday of the month, and made a list of post-closing commitments that included severance and retention. My stepfather signed his name darker and darker with each page, and my uncle did that thing where he grins with only his teeth. When we stood up, Rick leaned over and spoke too close to my ear. "Your mother won't forgive you," he said. "You'll be rich and alone." I stepped back so the air between us felt normal. "I've been broke and alone," I said. "This seems like an upgrade." The trip back to Ohio felt shorter because my brain was trying to sort 5 arguments at once: loyalty to my father's plan, my mother's pride that sticks like glue to anything she calls ours, the practical work of closing, the sinking feeling that my relationship with her had blown a gasket, and the odd quiet inside me that only shows up when I've done something I know I won't take back. On the second weekend of the month, I stopped at Aunt Denise's garage sale because the sign caught me off guard, a piece of cardboard with "Closet Clean Out, SAT 8 to 12" written in her neat hand. She sells things to chat with neighbors and make room for new craft projects. She also uses it as an excuse to keep eyes on my mother, because when families get messy, it helps to stand on a driveway with a folding table and $4 in a cash box. I bought 2 mismatched mugs and a framed county map from the 80s, even though I didn't need any of it. Aunt Denise handed me the change and squeezed my fingers in that light way that says I see you without making it a scene. "She's been telling people you're unstable," she murmured, eyes on a couple examining a bundle of baby clothes. "She also said you ran up a credit card she co-signed, and she had to cancel your plane ticket to keep you from hurting yourself." I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten because the lie had a plausible coat of paint. "The card has a $200 limit," I said. "I used it for gas twice when my debit got flagged." She canceled my flight because she wanted me to miss the vote. That afternoon, I went home to an envelope stuck to my door with blue painter's tape. Inside was a letter from a precinct officer about a wellness check requested by a concerned parent, which meant I had 24 hours to call and confirm I was alive and not a danger to myself. I dialed, spoke to a woman with tired kindness in her voice, and told her I was fine, employed, and not in crisis. "We get these sometimes in custody messes and money families," she said, tone professional. "Thanks for returning the call. I'll close it out." I set the phone down and leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window because my body needed something solid to press into. The radio on the kitchen counter hummed through a run of local news, a high school football score wrap-up, and a weather forecast that promised rain on Tuesday. I opened the fridge and realized I had nothing but 2 eggs and a half glass of orange juice, so I made an omelet with cheese and ate it standing up because sitting felt like a commitment. On Monday, which was the last Monday before payday, Ms. Chu called and said the buyer had sent over the first draft of closing documents and she needed me to review the purchase price allocation because there were tax implications I'd need to understand now. Not when the accountant called me in a panic in April. "I'll come by your office," I said. "Bring coffee," she replied. "Your stepfather's camp sent a list of last-minute clarifications, and I need caffeine to keep my voice friendly." I laughed because she gave me permission to without making me feel stupid. I brought 2 iced coffees. The papers made a thick whispery sound when we moved them, and the numbers looked like a code my father would have liked to solve. When we were done, she leaned back and looked at me. "You're going to be liquid for the first time in your life," she said, no heat in her tone. "You need a plan that keeps you from buying your emotions a house. You also need to decide what you owe people who made a mess on your way here." I rubbed a spot on my forearm where the skin always goes dry when I'm stressed. "I'm not going to swing a bat at my family," I said. "I'm also not going to hand them the bat and ask them to aim. Somewhere in there is a middle line. My mother tried a new angle by midweek." She left a voicemail that began with a sigh she uses to reset a room and said she had found a buyer willing to come in at 168 if we paused paperwork and gave them a week. I forwarded it to Ms. Chu without comment and then put my phone on Do Not Disturb because the thick behind my eyes needed a break. An hour later, my stepbrother, Keith, messaged me on Facebook with a screenshot of a group text I wasn't in, cousins and spouses weighing in on my temper and how I'd always been difficult, which made me smile in a tired way because difficult is code for we didn't get our way. Keith added, "I think Mom is taking this personally." I typed, "That's on her," and deleted it because I didn't want to fight with a man who changes oil for a living and never asked to sit between two women who can turn a kitchen into a courtroom. On Friday, the Friday before homecoming, the buyer's team came to town to tour the Akron facility and meet with managers. I joined the walkthrough and shook hands with people who had known me since I was old enough to ride in a forklift on Dad's lap. One of the line supervisors pulled me aside by the loading dock, the smell of diesel and something sweet from the bakery pallets strong in the air. "You're doing right by this," he said in a low voice. "Your old man was proud of you. Don't let the noise knock you off balance." I nodded, and the gratitude I felt landed in my shoulders like a weight I knew how to carry. After they left, I sat in my car and watched the high school parade roll by in the distance, kids in leather jackets waving from flatbeds, a brass section practicing a song they weren't quite ready to play. My phone buzzed again, a number I didn't recognize. It was a banker from a private client group, polite and direct. Someone had attempted to change the beneficiary information on a pending account using a fax letter with my name typed at the bottom. He had called to verify because the signature looked like a copy of a copy. The back of my neck went cold the way it does when a window is open and you didn't realize. "Do not process any requests that don't come from me in person," I said. "I'll be at your branch when it opens on Monday." I drove home past a church sign that read "Pancake Breakfast, second Saturday, 8 a.m., and thought about how much I wanted the world to be just that simple again. Pancakes, coffee, neighbors clapping for the marching band. Instead, I had a closing date marked in red on my calendar, a mother who had escalated from petty to dangerous, and a stepfather whose smile had started to look like a man bracing for a punch. I didn't plan revenge the way movies do. I planned a steady march through offices where the carpet is low and the coffee is always warm. I would set boundaries with a bank manager and a notary and a polite officer at a counter who knows how to scan a signature and spot a stroke that doesn't fit. The circle on my calendar around the third Friday of the month felt like a finish line I couldn't see yet, but the math of it worked. 8 more days, then the wire, then the quiet after the noise, or at least a different kind of noise. That Saturday morning, I showed up at the pancake breakfast and paid $10 for a plate that tasted like sugar and butter and childhood. People asked how I was with that lowered voice kindness Midwesterners have when they know there's a story, but don't want to insert themselves in it. I said I was fine and asked about their kids and their yards and whether the raccoons were still getting into the trash, and for an hour I let my nervous system remember how to be in a room without making a case. Back home, I opened my mother's text thread and scrolled without tapping anything, reading the bait she had thrown the last 2 days. "You owe us. You can't do this to family, you'll see." And I set the phone down and started a list in a cheap spiral notebook of every office I needed to see on Monday, every name on a piece of paper that needed a line drawn under it. I don't usually make lists, but this felt like grabbing handholds on a rough wall. The radio in the kitchen murmured a ball game and a weather guy's prediction for early frost, and the small normal sounds held me steady while the bigger pieces waited for me to pick them up again. On Monday, I was at the bank before the doors unlocked, standing under the overhang with 3 other people, an older man clutching a deposit bag, a woman in scrubs scrolling a grocery list, and a teenager in a leather jacket yawning so wide his jaw popped. When the latch clicked and the manager waved us in, the lobby smelled like printer toner and something citrus they use on the counters before customers arrive. I asked for the branch manager and was shown to a glassed-in office near the safe deposit wall. He introduced himself as Brad in the quiet way Midwestern men do when they don't want to make anyone nervous. And he invited me to sit and put my folder on the round table between us. I told him I had received a call from their private client team about an attempted beneficiary change via fax, and I wanted my profile flagged so nothing could move without me standing there with my driver's license and my left hand on the counter. He nodded, typed, asked me to pick a code word I wouldn't forget under stress, and then turned his screen a fraction so I could see the side panel where the request sat with a red triangle next to it. The letter was on generic Carter Family Office letterhead, which we don't actually have, with my name typed at the bottom in a font my mother likes for Christmas cards. The fax header showed a strip mall number on the east side near the highway exit where there's a sub shop and a packing and shipping place that sells mailbox rentals. Brad's lips thinned in a way that wasn't quite a frown. "We don't accuse in these rooms," he said, carefully. "But we do record. I'll ask our security team to pull the inbound path and preserve the attempt. I'll also place a hard note on your file that no changes occur without your physical presence, photo ID, and the verbal code you just gave me. Do you want a temporary freeze on outbound wires?" I felt my shoulders loosen half an inch. "Yes," I said. "For 7 days, unless I'm standing here." I drove to the strip mall because I wanted to see the place that had tried to move my name like it was a puzzle piece. The air inside the shipping store smelled like tape and cardboard dust. A clerk with a buzz cut and a Cleveland hoodie looked up from a scale and asked if I needed to ship or print. I gave him my polite smile that leaves people room to say no. I told him I believe someone had used their fax machine the previous afternoon to send a bank instruction using my name, and I was filing a police report. Would he be willing to hold the camera footage from the counter for law enforcement if they asked? His face went through 3 expressions: annoyance, caution, something like empathy, and he said he couldn't share without a request, but the cameras were up and the DVR kept 10 days. He slid a card across the counter with a back number for their regional manager and wrote, "Hold footage for Lauren Carter, bank fax yesterday 3:19 p.m. in block letters." "Most folks think fax is invisible," he said, voice low. "It's less invisible than they think." I thanked him and stepped back into the light where the blacktop throws heat even on a cool day. The precinct desk sergeant recognized my name from the wellness check and gave me a look that said, "Kindly you again." I told him this wasn't about feelings. It was about a bank instruction attempted via fax with my typed name, and here were the dates and times. He took my statement with the same steady pen he probably uses for property markouts, asked whether I had reason to believe the sender was a family member, and wrote, "Possible identity, Ms. Rep." in the margin like a man who has learned to keep it short and neutral. He gave me a card with a case number and said a detective would call if they needed the footage. He also said, in a tone I appreciated, that he was sorry I was having the kind of month that makes people camp out in lobbies. I went home by way of the grocery store because I had 2 eggs and no coffee left, and I stood in the cereal aisle where the fluorescent lights buzz and texted Ms. Chu a photo of the card with the case number. She wrote back, "Good. We're nearly through diligence." Buyer asked for payroll details. Rick's team sent 3 spreadsheets with different totals. I am smiling through my teeth. By lunchtime, the buyer's counsel had scheduled final facility walkthroughs and asked for confirmation of the shareholder list one more time because they'd received a courtesy note from my mother implying there was a dispute. Ms. Chu called to say she had replied with the signed consent and a recap of the bylaws and that everyone should stop pretending we were a soap opera. I took the call on the sidewalk outside the hardware store during my break while the delivery truck beeped in reverse, and she added, more gently, that she wanted me to think about a trust structure for my proceeds if the projection held. People act strange around numbers, she said. You're sensible, but this is still a lot of oxygen. We can set you up with a corporate trustee and a simple instrument that keeps strangers from knocking on your door with proposals. I leaned on the cart handle because my knees had gone a little loose from the way she said proceeds like an actual thing and not a story. Do you have a person who won't talk down to me? I asked. I do, she said. You'll like her. She grew up stocking her parents' bodega. She's unimpressed by big checks. The next escalation arrived on my porch under a rubber band at dinner time, an envelope from a local firm my mother likes to hire when she wants the stationery to do intimidation for her. The letter accused me of tortious interference for destabilizing internal financing by speaking at the township meeting about Tom's expansion and demanded I retract my damaging statements and commit in writing to future non-involvement. I read it once, read it again slower, and then handed it to Aunt Denise when she stopped by with Tupperware from her neighbor's potluck. She read, pursed her lips, and said, "They're trying to make you flinch." I set the letter on the counter and called Miss Chu, who answered on the second ring even though it was after 6. She told me to put the letter in a folder marked noise and then emailed a paragraph I could send back that said, politely, I had shared public records in a public forum, and their client's dispute should be with the origin of the funds, not the room where those funds asked to be seen. I sent it, CC'd her, and then made a grilled cheese because I needed something warm that didn't require a recipe. On Tuesday, the second Tuesday of the month, the bank's fraud unit called with a simple question that made my palms go damp again. Would I be willing to come in and identify people in a still image pulled from the shipping store video? I said yes, even though my stomach tightened at the thought. The image showed the counter from the side angle and a man in a collared shirt with his head turned just enough that you could see the profile if you knew the person. Rick's right ear has a small notch where he caught it on a cabinet corner last year. The still had that notch. The clerk had printed a receipt log showing a fax to the bank at 3:19 p.m. and a second fax 4 minutes later to a number that matched my mother's office. I felt my throat go dry and asked for a cup of water because I didn't want my voice to crack in a room with a camera. The bank officer thanked me, and I drove home with the radio low, the local news talking about leaf pickup schedules and a story about a church in Westerville celebrating its 125th anniversary. And the ordinary kindness of it helped my breathing find a steady place. When I got to my apartment, there was a message from Keith asking if I had 5 minutes. I almost ignored it, then called because ignoring the few family members who sometimes choose sanity over team spirit is how you end up alone at Thanksgiving. Keith doesn't love conflict. He changes oil and rotates tires and keeps his head down and goes to softball on Thursdays. He started with an apology that wasn't rehearsed and then said he thought I should know something, and the words came out in a rush because if he paused, he would lose courage. He had been at my mother's on Sunday night when she and Rick went through a stack of old binders because they were trying to find a clause they could use to slow the sale. He got sent to the garage to look in the blue tote with archive written on masking tape. And at the bottom under a box of Christmas ornaments there was a heavy envelope sealed with red string and my last name in my father's careful print. The front said, deliver to Lauren upon signing of any sale of Carter Temperature Logistics or upon my spouse's attempt to block same. Keith, who knows the smell of trouble better than he lets on, slid the envelope into the pocket of his hoodie when my mother went inside to take a phone call. He had been carrying it around like a hot potato since. He didn't want to hand it to me without warning because, in his words, the house had been a hornet's nest and he didn't want to get stung. I can drop it off tonight, he said, but I don't want to see anyone. Can I leave it with your neighbor and text you? I swallowed because my mouth suddenly felt like cotton. Yes, I said. Thank you. I'll leave a note with Mrs. Patel in 2B. She'll think she's in a spy movie and love it. The envelope was heavy enough that my hands felt its weight through the paper. I sat at my table, slid the red string off, and breathed carefully because breathing too fast makes vision fuzzy for me. Inside was a letter on my father's company stationery with the old logo from before we updated the brand. He had written in pen, not because he didn't trust a printer, but because he wanted me to hear his voice in the loops. He said if I was reading it, someone had finally made me choose between being liked and being right. He said he had structured the company the way he did because he knew my mother's pride could turn a business plan into a personal grudge, and he wanted me to have the leverage to keep the crew paid and the trucks moving long after anyone's feelings caught fire. He named Ms. Chu and told me she would remember a lunch where he made her promise to look me in the eye and tell me the truth even if it cost her a client. He included a second sheet, notarized the same day as his last will. That appointed a corporate trustee to receive the net proceeds of his shares from any sale and to distribute them to me for my support and for a list of specific purposes. He had underlined education for future kids if I had them. The food pantry we had volunteered at on the second Saturday of every month when I was little, and a scholarship at the tech school for logistics certs. He also wrote one steady paragraph that made my stomach twist and then settle. He had reason to believe Rick had been paying personal charges through a vendor account he'd called consulting, and he had asked our CFO, Elena Morales, to keep a separate ledger from the day he went into chemo. He told me to ask her for the yellow file. Then he wrote, "I hope you never need any of this," and signed his name. I called Miss Chu and read the last paragraph to her. She was quiet for a beat and then said, in a voice that had more softness than I expected, that she remembered the lunch. And she had wondered whether he had tucked anything else away because he had the habit of setting guardrails in rooms where people thought they would never need them. She gave me Elena's cell. I called and left a message, and Elena called back at 9:30 while I was wiping down my counter and trying not to eat cold leftovers because my stomach was tight. She asked me to come to the Akron office at noon on Wednesday and to park in the side lot, not the front, because she didn't want to turn a file handoff into a hallway scene. The next day, she met me in a conference room that smelled faintly like copier heat and set a yellow accordion file in front of me with a hand on it like she was blessing it. Inside were 18 months of invoices from our Halverson Consulting billed to the company for strategic integration, 3 hotel folios from a resort in Scottsdale under Rick's name that had been routed through a travel agent and then reimbursed us, vendor hospitality, and a spreadsheet with columns so neat I wanted to hug the person who built them, dates, amounts, GL codes, questions in the margin. Elena had also printed an email from my father to her, subject line, "Hold steady," asking her to lock the vendor list and refuse any new additions over $5,000 without a second signature. He didn't want to embarrass your mother, she said. He wanted to document, and he hoped he would live long enough to handle it himself. I pressed my palms flat on the table and felt the cool laminate under my skin. Is it criminal? I asked, voice low. She shook her head slowly. It's sloppy and selfish, she said. We can claw back some of it through adjustments at close. The rest is a conversation you'll have to have with yourself about how far you want to carry a grudge. The discovery of the yellow file did not make me want to carry anything sharp. It made me want to finish the closing, pay people what we owed them, and build my life in a way that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I took the file to Ms. Chu, who smiled the way people smile when a puzzle they've been working on gets the corner piece. She forwarded select pages to the buyer's counsel, not because she wanted to tank the deal, but because she wanted to clean the table before dessert. The buyer wrote back in 15 minutes with a line that made the air in the room change. They would reduce the purchase price by the total of the questionable reimbursements, captured as a closing adjustment. and accept a side letter from our company acknowledging the payments and promising not to bill them to the new entity in any form. Rick's team sent 4 emails using the words immaterial and ordinary course and MS. Chu replied once with 2 sentences and a PDF of the Scottsdale folios, and then she put her phone face down and took a sip of coffee like a woman who knows when to stop giving free words. By the last Thursday before payday, the buyer had confirmed wire instructions. The title company had sent out the closing packet, and the radio in my kitchen said we might get an early frost. My mother left me 2 voicemails that were each 3 minutes long. I didn't listen because I could hear the cadence through the speaker and knew what she sounded like when she decided the room would bend eventually. She did, however, call Aunt Denise and say I would never forgive myself if I cut my family out of a once-in-a-lifetime transition, and Aunt Denise told her, quietly, that a once-in-a-lifetime transition was another way of saying a door closes. And maybe the important thing was whether you shut your fingers in it on the way. That night I sat at my table and opened my father's letter again, the part about the scholarship for logistics techs, and wrote to the community college 2 towns over asking about the process for setting one up. A woman named Claire wrote back within an hour, and her email read like a person who had found a small grant at the bottom of a drawer and was excited to put it to work. I slept 3 hours and woke at 4 with the shape of a plan in my chest that wasn't revenge so much as guardrails. Sell, settle, hold the proceeds in a trust that doesn't answer to my mother's moods, fund the scholarship. Buy myself a used pickup for the moves I was going to make, and avoid the habit of proving points by standing in rooms where no one had ever clapped for me. The morning of closing, 3rd Friday of the month, my stomach felt jumpy the way it used to before time tests. I wore a clean shirt and shoes that didn't squeak and parked 2 blocks away so I could walk past the bakery and catch the smell of cinnamon rolls to steady me. The conference room hummed with printers and low talk. There were pastries on the credenza and a stack of manila envelopes with our names on them. Miss Chu handed me a pen and pointed where to sign, and I kept my hand steady by pressing my left palm to the edge of the table. Rick signed his name like he wanted to dent the paper. My mother did not attend. She had sent a limited proxy with 3 conditions that read like foot stomps in lawyer language, and the buyer initialed next to 2 and ignored the 3rd. When we were done, when the last initial had landed and the escrow officer said the word funding, my phone buzzed with a text from the bank, incoming wire received, and the numbers were large enough that the world felt a little tilted for a second. MS. She put her hand on my forearm, just a touch, and said, breathe. I did, and the air went in and came out the way it's supposed to. I didn't go straight home. I drove to the public access at the reservoir and sat on a picnic table and watched a man teach his son to cast a fishing line, the boy's shoulders hunching with effort and then loosening when the line sailed farther than he thought it would. I called the corporate trustee woman MS. Chu had recommended her name is Tessa, and she has a warm laugh that she uses sparingly, and I told her I wanted to move the proceeds into a trust with boring, sensible rules that would make it hard to turn every crisis into a check. She asked about goals, and I said I wanted to buy a place with a yard, fund the scholarship, give Aunt Denise a monthly stipend without making Thanksgiving weird, and build a cushion that would keep my mother from trying to solve her feelings with my accounts. She said she would draft something I could read without a dictionary and would send me a list of what to expect when people start calling with opportunities and the word guarantee in their mouths. I said thank you in a voice that sounded more like myself than it had in weeks. The climax didn't happen at the closing table. It happened 4 hours later in my apartment parking lot when my mother stepped out of Rick's truck like she owned the ground. She carried a folder and wore the jacket she wears when she wants to look like a person in control. She didn't knock. She stood near the stairs, so I would have to pass her to get to my door. You didn't have to do this, she said, and her voice was already half a sob and half a scold. You didn't have to humiliate me. My throat went dry again, but I didn't swallow because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me nervous. I didn't humiliate you, I said. I sold a company that was ready to sell, and I kept the numbers honest on the way out. You canceled my flight to stop me from being in the room. You faxed my bank like a teenager trying to forge a note. You sent a wellness check. Those were humiliations. For you. She flinched as if the words had weight. Rick stared at his shoes and said nothing. She tried a new angle, the one where she calls herself a widow and reminds me of casseroles delivered and nights spent in hospital chairs, and I kept my face still because my father deserves my respect, not my mother's weaponized memories. You'll regret cutting us out, she said, and her us made me realize she didn't know how to stop gathering people to her side even when the game was over. I didn't cut you out, I said. I closed a sale. The trust will pay Dad's bequests the way he wrote them. If you want a conversation about Scottsdale and the vendor accounts, you can have it with Ms. Chu. They left without slamming a door, which I will always count as restraint in a month that felt like one long clang. I went inside and turned on the late local news because the sound of a weatherman pointing at a map makes my nervous system behave. The anchor read off scores from the Friday night games and a story about a church fall festival with a chili cook-off, and I stood at my sink and ran cold water over my wrists again, because that's what I do when my heart tries to run. Then I took my father's letter out of the folder and read the line where he said, "You don't owe anyone your patience when they spend it like pennies," and I put it back and turned off the lamp. The month wasn't over and neither was the story, but the center of it had shifted. The wires had landed, the guardrails were up. And the house I was going to build didn't have to include a room for the part of my mother that prefers an audience to a conversation. The morning after closing, I woke before my alarm to a tight feeling in my chest and the faint smell of someone else's toast moving through the apartment vents. And for a long minute I lay there and watched the stripe of light on the ceiling and counted breaths until my heartbeat settled into the slow roll you get after a run. The wire had landed the day before. Ms. Chu had said the numbers were in motion. Tessa had smiled through the phone and said she would move everything into the trust account as soon as the bank finished its checks, and that once the dust cleared and the accountant did his early estimates, I would see something close to $78 million sitting inside a structure with my name at the top and a set of boring rules that would keep strangers' ideas from moving in. I made coffee because the action felt normal. The radio on the counter hummed through the farm report, the weather, a Teacher of the Month segment, and a note about the Saturday garage sale circuit starting up early because someone had posted photos of a vintage fishing gear haul. That had the retirees whispering. I poured cream, stirred, and told myself that I could be a person who made a sandwich and checked her email, and went for a walk even on a day when the shape of my life had changed on paper. Tessa called at 9 with a list I wrote on the back of an envelope because I couldn't find a notebook, which seemed ridiculous considering I now had a trustee and a bank department with a dedicated email for me. We walked through the guardrails she had set that morning, a verbal code the bank would use, a freeze on wires over $50,000 unless I stood in front of a human with ID. A rule in the trust that gave me allowances for 2 personal purchases a year over a cap without committee review and required me to write a short paragraph explaining why I wanted them, not to impress anyone but to make me pause long enough to think. It made me laugh, a small puff of air that shook loose the jumpiness behind my ribs. I can live with paragraphs, I said. She asked about the scholarship line in my father's letter, and I told her I wanted to move fast on that small piece even if the rest took weeks. She said she'd call Claire at the community college and draft something we could sign on Monday. On her end, I heard a dog bark and a kettle hiss, and the ordinary music of somebody else's kitchen made me want eggs and toast. I could make one of those too. I ate at the diner because the apartment felt like a room where everything echoed. The place smelled like bacon and coffee and bleach from the morning mop. My server wore a shirt with a pumpkin on it because it was October now, not just September stretching out forever, and her pen ran out and she smacked it against her hand twice and apologized even though I told her it wasn't necessary. Aunt Denise slid into the booth across from me like we had planned it, which we hadn't. She lives 3 miles away and always seems to be exactly where I can stand seeing someone from my family. She ordered tea and didn't ask me how I was. She asked if I had eaten anything green in the last 24 hours, and if not, would I share her side of spinach. We talked about nothing for 10 minutes, because that's a bridge you walk over before you carry anything heavy. Then she said, softly, "Your mother is making calls. She told Barb at church you had locked her out of her own money and you were going to buy a sports car to make a point." I smiled into my cup because I could see the scene in the church kitchen, the scent of dish soap, the hum of the industrial dishwasher. "If I buy a car," I said, "it will be a used pickup so I can move things without imposing on people. And even that will have to wait until Tessa makes sure I'm not playing whack-a-mole with my impulses." Aunt Denise laughed, shook her head, reached across the table, and pressed 2 fingers lightly to the back of my hand like pressing a crease into wrapping paper. "Your father would approve of that sentence," she said. The process server found me just before noon, polite, embarrassed, the kind of man who apologizes even as he hands you something no one wants. He gave me a packet with a cover sheet that said emergency motion for temporary restraining order and a hearing date in bold for Monday morning. The motion accused me of dissipating marital assets, which made me blink because the company shares were never theirs together. It claimed I had interfered with medical care by selling a company that held health benefits for Rick. It said I was acting under undue influence of counsel, a phrase that made MS. Chu's eyebrows go up when I sent her a photo. My hands went cold, then hot. The motion also attached my mother's affidavit in which she said she was gravely concerned for my mental state given my impulsive, defiant acts, a thing I would have found funny if I had not been reading a stamp with a judge's name on it. Miss Chu called me before I could call her. She told me to breathe and to come by her office with the packet and the banker's case number and a copy of the wellness check card. We would draft a response over the weekend and show up on Monday with the file and the calm faces of people who have had enough of hallway theater. "Dress in layers," she said, practical. "Courtrooms run either too hot or too cold, and we will not lose our focus to shivers." That weekend was a sawtooth of quiet and phone buzzes. I stopped by the church on Saturday because I had promised to help at the pancake breakfast again and doled out sausage links with tongs while people told me it was almost too warm for October, and we all acted like the weather was the strangest part of the week. The high school's homecoming game played on a TV perched on a cart in the corner of the fellowship hall, the volume low. And when the local team's quarterback scrambled for a first down, 3 men near the coffee pots clapped in unison and then looked at their cups like they'd been caught doing something unguarded. Back at home, I sat at my table with the files spread like a fan, father's letter, yellow file from Elena, the bank fraud officer's still image of a profile with a notched ear, the shipping store clerk's note, the wellness check card, the signed consent and closing statement with the numbers that added and didn't wobble, the trust instrument with the treble clef paperclip holding my father's addendum, and Miss Chu's response with the short plain sentences that judges like. I thought about all the times my mother had told me, "You like to make it complicated," when what she meant was, "Please don't touch the truth." I thought about buying plane tickets with miles and the way a click on her phone had almost rerouted a company. I counted the 8 blocks from my apartment to the courthouse because it sounded easier than counting everything else. Monday morning, the hallway outside our courtroom held the smell of coffee and old carpet and nerves. People sat on benches and whispered the way kids do in school when they are sure the teacher can hear them. Rick's attorney stood near the window with a folder and a tight tie, his hair too neat for this county. My mother wore the jacket she wears when she intends to win a room into obedience and carried a folder like a shield, and when she saw me she did the complicated expression that is supposed to saddle a daughter with guilt, doubt, and a compulsion to fix things. I kept my face neutral and took a seat next to Ms. Chu, who handed me a peppermint like we were at church. The judge took the bench and his voice had a calm cadence that suggests he runs before work, not because he likes exercise, but because it quiets his head. He asked questions that didn't leave space for speeches. He asked whether the sale had closed, yes. He asked whether the proceeds had been wired, yes. He asked whether the funds were held in a trust titled to me under a document executed 3 years earlier by my father, yes. He asked whether my mother had standing to seek a restraining order against funds that were not hers. Ms. Chu said no and handed up the will excerpt and share register. He asked about the alleged beneficiary change. The bank's fraud officer spoke by phone and used words like attempt and preservation of inbound fax and profile flag that told the court there was more to the story than a mother's worry. My mother spoke, and for a minute I braced for the anger she saves for kitchen walls. Instead, she leaned hard on fragility. She told the judge she had been frightened by my reckless behavior and had canceled a plane ticket to keep me from making a terrible mistake, that she believed I was susceptible to manipulation by counsel, that I had always been a bit dramatic, that the sale of the company was premature, that she only wanted a week, a small pause, a chance to breathe. The judge listened with that polite blankness they teach judges on day one. Then Ms. Chu asked to call Elena as a witness by declaration, and the judge accepted her sworn statement describing the R. Halverson Consulting reimbursements and the Scottsdale folios and my father's hold steady email, which was not introduced to embarrass my mother, but to answer the question of whether there were reasons to establish guardrails beyond family drama. The judge asked Rick's counsel if he intended to respond to the substance of the consulting invoices. He said they were irrelevant to the motion. The judge nodded, then read the line in the will that gave my father's shares to me and the line in the trust that established my discretion with a corporate trustee. He denied the motion, not loudly, not kindly either, just in the straightforward voice people use when they have reading to do and a lunch break coming up. He said words about good faith and bad process, and then he did something I didn't expect. He told my mother and Rick to consider refraining from filing anything else for 30 days without first showing opposing counsel, and the court would be available for a status if they wanted to stop using paper like a football. Outside the courtroom, my mother put on sunglasses, even though the hallway had no windows, and said, "You chose them over me," and I felt the old itch to say sorry just to make the air less tight. I did not scratch. I chose my father's plan and the law. I said, "If you want to talk to me again before Thanksgiving, we can schedule a session with a mediator at church. If not, I am going to take a breather." She stared at me like I had started speaking a language she refused to learn. Rick looked like a man who had been told the vending machine took his dollar and there were no refunds. Miss Chu stood at my elbow like a lighthouse, which is not how I would describe a person usually, but she radiated that kind of steady. We left, and by the time I stepped into the October air, crisp and smelling faintly of leaves and distant smoke, my body released a stored breath I didn't realize I was keeping in my ribs. The week after court moved in small clicks. Tessa sent me a statement with numbers that looked like an address that didn't belong to me and yet did. The trust account now held $78,104,000 and change after adjustments, legal, and the closing cost cleanup. She called to talk about a first disbursement to buy me a house and fund the scholarship. I drove around town looking at places I could actually see myself living in, not showpieces that belong in magazines, just bungalows with porches and garages that wouldn't flood if the drain clogged. In a neighborhood 2 miles from the high school, I found a one-story place with a fenced yard and an old oak out front and a kitchen that still had its original built-in. The cellar had a church bulletin tacked to the corkboard with the pancake breakfast circled in pen. It felt like a sign, the good kind, not the dramatic kind. Tessa wired earnest money from the trust after I sent her a paragraph I wrote at my table explaining why I wanted this house in simple words. I could afford it without thinking, and yet I would think about it. The yard looked like a place where a grill would make sense. The driveway was long enough to park a used pickup and a canoe someday, if Aunt Denise decided she was done storing it. I slept better that night than I had since the airport. The scholarship came together with surprising ease. Claire at the community college sent a draft document called the Carter Logistics Scholarship with 2 tracks, one for older students changing careers into warehouse management and CDL training, one for students right out of high school who wanted the certifications that lead to supervisor positions. There was a line where I could write the purpose in my own voice. I wrote that this was to honor a man who taught me how to count pallets at 9 and how to balance kindness against math at 29, a man who believed a steady paycheck and a fair supervisor are the bones of a decent life. We signed, and Claire cried on the phone in a way that made me cry a little too, and the trust funded the first year. The local paper ran a short article about it on page 2 under a piece about leaf pickup. Aunt Denise cut it out and stuck it to her fridge door with a magnet shaped like a tomato. My mother tried one more round, texts that switched between sweet and sharp, friends who called to say I should forgive even if I had nothing to forgive, a cousin who showed up with a box of my baby photos like I had threatened to burn them. I kept the box and put the cousin on my porch with a cup of tea and told her she could tell anyone who asked that I was managing my month with more lists and fewer speeches. I wrote my mother a short letter with my hands sweating onto the paper and told her I would not take calls until Thanksgiving, but would accept 1 email a week if she kept it to factual updates and avoided calling me names. I offered a mediation date 2 Fridays from now at the church in the small conference room by the kitchen, because the coffee is good there and the folding chairs are as honest as furniture gets. I stuck a stamp on the letter because I wanted it to arrive slowly and to sit in her hand as an object that couldn't be swiped past like a notification. Keith came by with 2 plastic crates of old company t-shirts his shop had been using as rags and a face that said he wanted to talk even if he didn't know how. We sat on milk crates in my new garage because I hadn't moved furniture in yet, and he told me he felt like a person who had been asked to hold water in a colander. I'm not good at this, he said, and the statement was so bold and gentle that I put my hand on his shoulder for half a second, which is as much touching as either of us prefers. He said he had told our mother to stop using welfare words like betrayal about a business decision and to leave my bank alone, and she had cried and said he had turned on her, and he had told her he loved her and he was tired. And neither sentence fixed anything, but both were true. He asked about the scholarship and smiled for real when I told him the second track included CDL. We're always short drivers, he said. If you need someone to sit on a panel and tell kids the truth about brake checks at 4 a.m., I'll do it. I said I would hold him to that in January when the semester started. The buyer sent a note their first week running the facilities that the front office would be named for my father at the Akron site. They didn't ask my permission, they told me, and somehow that felt better. The sign went up on a Tuesday morning, a simple plaque with his name, the years he'd run the place, a line about fairness that made me swallow hard. I drove there after lunch with a bag of donuts and put the box on the break room table and didn't give a speech. Elena hugged me quickly in the doorway and said the yellow file had done its work. She said Rick had sent a 3-line apology to the buyer for the Scottsdale mess and had agreed to repay the reimbursements over 12 months through a reduction in his retention payment, and the buyer had moved on because they prefer functioning to drama, which is why they win. The closest I came to losing my balance that month was not in court or at the bank. It was at the airport on a Friday night 2 weeks after the closing when I walked in to meet Aunt Denise at arrivals because she had flown back from visiting her sister and didn't like driving home in the dark. I passed by gate B11 where the sign for the Dallas flight glowed in the same font that had told me canceled by traveler, and my stomach did a small flip like a body remembers before a brain decides. I bought a paper cup of coffee that tasted the same burnt way and stood for a second in the doorway of the newsstand where a wall of magazines made promises about 100 ways to fix a life in 6 steps. Aunt Denise came through the sliding doors with her rolling bag and her cardigan wrapped tight, and she saw my face and said, softly, "That was a big day," and I said, "It was," and we walked to the garage together. In the elevator, she looked at me with that sideways glance she uses to make a question feel less like a test. "Do you feel rich?" she asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Mostly I feel like someone who paid attention at the right times and had a lot of people who showed up when it mattered." She nodded and said, "That is rich," and the elevator dinged and spit us out into the damp air where we both looked up at the roofline because we always do. The mediation at church happened the way sensible things happen on time, in a small room, with bad coffee and a plate of store-bought cookies. The mediator was a retired principal who had learned how to keep boys from throwing desks in 9th grade, which felt relevant. My mother came with Rick and a legal pad. She did not look at me when she sat down. The mediator laid out rules that sounded like kindergarten in the best way. No interrupting, stay on your own side of the street, say what you want without assigning motives. My mother started with "You hurt me," and I let the sentence sit because the reflex to fix it is strong and useless. I said, "I sold a company. I kept records. I blocked a bank fax. I won't be spoken to like a problem to be solved. I will not be funding vacations or ventures that use the word bridge as an excuse." Rick tried to talk about legacy and the numbers we'd all invested, and Miss Chu, who had agreed to sit 2 chairs back and keep her mouth shut, coughed once and Rick stopped. The mediator asked me what I would accept, and I told him 3 things. I would continue paying Aunt Denise a monthly amount out of my discretionary fund because she had been the one person who didn't turn me into a story. I would set aside a small yearly sum for family medical emergencies that would be administered by Tessa's office, so I didn't have to choose between a text and a bill, and I would not pay for any business venture that didn't come with a bank's letter, a partner who wasn't related to me, and a plan that didn't use the word passion as its engine. My mother opened her mouth and closed it like a person who had thought I would come to the table ready to hand out checks to stop a feeling. She said, "You'll regret this when you need your family," and I said, with no heat, "If the only way I have family is to pay for it, I don't need that kind." In late October, I moved into the bungalow. The movers carried the heavy things. I carried the small boxes that hold the pieces you don't trust other people to drop: photo albums, folders, mugs with chips that fit your hand. The first night I slept on a mattress on the floor because the bed frame would take another day to arrive and I didn't care. I left the window cracked and the house smelled like old wood and dust and a faint trace of lemon oil from whoever had cleaned before me. The neighbor's TV floated through the wall. I could hear a game in the 7th inning, the low hum of a crowd. I texted Tessa a photo of the porch, and she sent back a line about the importance of a good chair and a bad grill and the satisfaction of a clean sweep in a card game. I sent her a thumbs up because I didn't have better words. The next morning, I took a walk to the corner where a garage sale sign had been tacked to a telephone pole with a staple gun, and I followed the arrows to a driveway where a woman was selling a set of mixing bowls and 3 lamps. I bought a lamp, carried it the half-mile home, and felt my shoulders loosen in a way money doesn't buy. The last Sunday of the 2nd month, I went to church and sat in the back. The sermon was about harvest and not wasting what's in front of you. The usher's handshake had the same dry warmth it always has. Afterward, I stood on the lawn and listened to two men argue gently about the Browns' chances, and a woman talk about her grandson's science fair project, and a kid describe with exact seriousness the costume he was wearing for Halloween. My mother did not appear. Aunt Denise came up beside me and slipped her arm through mine for a second, then let go because she knows my body resists being held for long. "You look different," she said. "Not richer," she added quickly, as if she'd stepped on a social trap and wanted to jump off. "Just not braced." I knew what she meant. The muscles in my neck had been sore for weeks. Now they just felt like a neck. The text from my mother arrived that night around 9. "You think you won," it read. "Wait until you need help." I stared at it for a full minute and then did what Tessa told me to do with communications that were not asks or facts. I archived it. Then I opened my father's letter for the last time that month and read the last line again, the one where he told me to buy shoes that fit and to keep a bag by the door for trips that mattered and not to let anyone make me late for my own life. I set the letter back under the paperclip. I turned off the lamp. I stood at the kitchen sink with my hands under cold water for 15 seconds, a habit I had built without noticing, and then I walked out onto my small porch and listened to the quiet. Somewhere 2 streets over, a garage band worked on a song and a dog barked exactly 3 times. A bike rolled by with a light blinking red. I thought about the first text, "Have fun walking home, loser," and smiled, because I had walked home that night in September in the most literal way possible, out of the terminal into the dark with a suitcase I had to roll over a sidewalk crack. And now I had walked myself into a place where I owned my name on paper and in rooms, where I could sit on a porch and not brace for a car to pull up with a speech to deliver. If people need to hear a big number to make sense of a story, fine. The trust holds around $78 million that I will do something sensible with over years. But if you want the real part, the part one feel in my shoulders when I wake up, it's smaller. A house key on a plain ring, a scholarship letter ready for a kid who shows up at dawn to stock frozen bread, a bank that will not move a dollar unless I look someone in the eye, and a mother who has to learn that loving me means looking at me without a balance sheet in her hand. A week later, on a Tuesday cold enough to make my breath show, the corporate trustee sent the first draw for the scholarship and a small check to Aunt Denise with a little note attached that made her cry. She cried because somebody had written, "Thank you for your study," and not because of the amount. I drove the 5 miles to the reservoir with a thermos of coffee and stood on the edge watching a man teach his kid to throw a baseball in gloves that were a size too big. The kid missed twice, then caught one, and both of them laughed, the easy kind, not the nervous kind. On the way back, my radio played a short piece about a local woman funding technical programs at the community college, no names. Just a list of practical classes and an interview with a student who said he was tired of jobs with tips and wanted something with hours and benefits. I looked at the houses rolling past, paint peeling in places, porches held up by posts that could use sanding, pumpkins on steps, a cardboard sign for a garage sale next Saturday, and I felt a quiet settle the way sugar dissolves in coffee. Not dramatic. Not visible unless you taste it. If there's revenge here, it's not the movie kind. It's the steady refusal to let someone else's pride pick my flights, set my calendar, or sign my name. And when the next text comes, and it will, telling me I owe someone a kindness in the shape of a blank check, I will do what I did at the counter at Gate B11 the morning my life tried to tilt. I will keep my voice even. I will step to the side so other people can move, and I will find the person whose job it is to check what the screen says against what the rules allow. Then I will pay for my own ticket, and I will walk where I'm headed with shoes that fit.